Wind moves through broken stone where an empire once stood. Sand drifts through roofless halls. In places where soldiers once marched beneath painted banners and kings announced victories to crowds of thousands, there is now only silence broken by insects, distant birds, and the slow cracking of ancient mud brick beneath the heat of the sun. Entire capitals lie flattened into low hills that from a distance barely seem unnatural at all. Travellers pass them without understanding that beneath their feet rest collapsed palaces. Libraries turn to ash, temples stripped by centuries of scavengers, and the remains of one of the most powerful civilizations the ancient world had ever seen. What survives is fragmented, a king's name carved into shattered stone, burned records buried beneath layers of dirt, terrified descriptions written by enemies who watched their cities fall, incomplete lists of tribute, broken statues with their faces deliberately destroyed. Even now, scholars still debate the true scale of this vanished superpower, because so much of its memory was intentionally erased, scattered, or buried beneath later civilizations that rose from its ruins. The strange thing is not that the empire collapsed. Every empire collapses eventually. The strange thing is how close it came to disappearing entirely from history. For long stretches of time, people living among its ruins no longer knew who had built them. Ancient walls became quarries for newer kingdoms. Massive carved stones vanished into farms, mosques, fortresses, roads, and villages. Rivers shifted course, deserts expanded, entire cities disappeared beneath dust. In some places, local legends survived longer than historical memory itself. There were stories of giant kings, cursed capitals, forgotten conquerors who had once ruled lands beyond the horizon. But legends rarely preserve details. Time grinds certainty into myth. And yet this civilization once dominated enormous stretches of the ancient world with a confidence that bordered on terrifying. Its armies moved across mountains, deserts, forests, and river valleys with astonishing speed. Cities surrendered at the mere rumour of approaching campaigns. Rebel populations vanished. Captured rulers were paraded before foreign crowds as warnings. Royal inscriptions described the empire not simply as strong, but as chosen by the gods to impose order upon chaos itself. The deeper archaeologists dig, the stranger the story becomes. Because the empire was not only brutal, it was organised with a level of sophistication that many later civilizations quietly borrowed while publicly condemning it. Roads connected distant territories across hostile terrain. Administrative systems tracked labour, tribute, crops, and military supply across regions containing millions of people. Vast capitals displayed artistic traditions gathered from conquered cultures hundreds of miles apart. Royal engineers reshaped landscapes. Massive irrigation systems turned dry plains into productive agricultural zones. Scholars recorded eclipses, trade inventories, rituals, taxes, and diplomatic agreements on clay tablets meant to survive forever. Many of them did survive, barely. Some were discovered inside rooms blackened by fire, where collapsing roofs accidentally baked clay tablets hard enough to endure for thousands of years. Others emerged from desert sands after storms exposed buried foundations. Entire archives appeared beneath ruined palaces where invading armies had destroyed nearly everything except the records hidden under fallen stone. What survives in the records suggests not a primitive kingdom lost in obscurity, but a civilization operating at a scale that stunned even its contemporaries. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The empire rose in a world already crowded with ambitious states struggling for survival. Across the ancient Near East, kingdoms fought constantly over rivers, farmland, trade routes, and access to metals that could determine military power. The region was not stable. It was a landscape of recurring collapse and recovery. Droughts destroyed harvests. Invasions shattered dynasties. Cities rose rapidly and vanished just as fast. Alliances shifted with brutal speed. Every generation inherited memories of catastrophe. In that environment, survival favoured states capable of adaptation, discipline, and relentless expansion. Small kingdoms that remained isolated were usually consumed by stronger neighbours sooner or later. The civilization at the centre of this story learned that lesson early. It developed in a harsh environment where agricultural survival depended on careful control of rivers, seasonal cycles, and labour. Its homeland sat near dangerous frontiers exposed to raids, migrations, and rival powers. Fear was never far away, neither was ambition. The earliest traces are modest compared to what comes later. Small fortified settlements, local rulers competing for influence, agricultural communities built around rivers that could both sustain and destroy them depending on the season. But beneath these early settlements lay advantages that would slowly transform the balance of power across the region. The land itself shaped the civilization's mentality. Wide open terrain offered little natural protection. Mountain peoples descended from the highlands. Nomadic groups crossed frontier zones. Neighbouring kingdoms constantly tested borders. To survive, rulers learned to centralise authority, mobilise labour quickly, and maintain armies capable of a rapid response. Over generations, temporary military organisation hardened into permanent state structure. Even their art reveals something unsettling about how they viewed power. In surviving relief carvings, rulers are rarely shown at rest. Kings hunt lions, oversee executions, lead sieges, receive tribute, and tower physically above ordinary humans. Warfare appears everywhere. Violence is presented not as chaos, but as proof of cosmic order. Royal inscriptions boast of conquered cities with extraordinary detail. Some scholars believe these descriptions were exaggerated for propaganda purposes, and the evidence remains incomplete in many cases. But there is little doubt that fear itself became one of the Empire's most effective weapons. And fear travelled faster than armies. Messengers carried stories across caravan routes and river systems long before imperial troops arrived. Merchants described enormous siege engines, mass deportations, disciplined infantry formations, and rulers who punished rebellion with horrifying spectacle. Some accounts were certainly amplified by rumour. Ancient people understood psychological warfare as well as any modern strategist. But archaeology continues to confirm that many of the Empire's campaigns were devastatingly real. Whole cities show burn layers dating to the same periods described in royal campaigns. Skeletons remain trapped beneath collapsed gates. Hastily abandoned storage rooms still contain tools, jewellery, and unfinished meals left behind during sudden destruction. In frontier regions, defensive architecture changes dramatically after contact with imperial expansion, suggesting neighbouring states rapidly adapted to the threat. Yet conquest alone does not explain how the Empire endured. Countless ancient powers conquered territory briefly before collapsing under their own weight. What made this civilization different was its ability to absorb conquered lands into an expanding imperial system. Administrators followed armies. Roads followed administrators. Tax systems followed roads. Local elites were sometimes removed, sometimes integrated, depending on what best served imperial stability. Deportation became policy. Entire populations were relocated across huge distances. Breaking regional resistance while supplying labour to strategic areas, it was ruthless, but effective. The Empire became a machine for turning conquest into infrastructure. Centuries later, historians from rival cultures would portray these rulers as monsters almost beyond comprehension. Some of that hostility reflected genuine trauma. Some reflected political necessity. Later empires often defined themselves by demonizing predecessors. The civilization that replaced this ancient power inherited many of its systems while carefully reshaping public memory. Libraries were destroyed, capitals repurposed, official narratives rewritten. No single explanation fully accounts for how such a massive civilization faded so deeply into obscurity. Part of the answer lies in the fragility of ancient records themselves. Papyrus decays, wood burns, stone breaks, languages die. But another part lies in something more deliberate. Ancient societies understood memory as power. To erase a rival from history was a final form of conquest. Even now, archaeologists uncover traces in places long believed insignificant. Beneath modern towns, under fields, beside rivers that changed course centuries ago, fragments continue emerging from the ground. A carved seal, a military dispatch, a collapsed gateway large enough to dwarf modern vehicles. Each discovery slightly reshapes the picture, and slowly, from dust and silence, the outline of the forgotten superpower begins to return. Long before the Empire's armies terrified neighbouring kingdoms, before colossal palaces rose from the plains and royal inscriptions declared dominion over distant lands, there was only a difficult landscape balanced between abundance and danger. The civilization's heartland formed along great river systems that fed narrow corridors of fertile soil through an otherwise unforgiving world. In spring, the rivers carried life. In years of unstable weather, they carried ruin. Floods swept away fields. Drought hardened the earth into cracked stone. Entire harvests could vanish within a single season. People learned quickly that survival depended not on individual strength, but on organisation. Water had to be directed, stored, measured, and defended. Canals required constant maintenance. Irrigation systems demanded labour on a scale impossible for isolated villages. Even in its earliest phases, the society that would later dominate the region grew accustomed to centralised authority because nature itself rewarded coordination and punished disorder. The landscape surrounding the fertile zones was equally important. To the north rose rugged hills and mountain corridors rich in timber, stone, and metals. To the south stretched territories connected to older urban civilizations already competing for influence. Caravan routes crossed deserts carrying copper, tin, textiles, livestock, incense, and luxury goods from astonishing distances. Whoever controlled the intersections between these worlds gained access not only to wealth, but to information. Merchants carried rumours as efficiently as cargo. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that the early rulers understood geography with remarkable clarity. Fortified settlements began appearing near river crossings, trade arteries, and defensible elevations. These were not random villages expanding naturally over time. Many show signs of deliberate planning, including walls, storage systems, and administrative buildings positioned to monitor both resources and movement. Even at this stage, the foundations of empire were already visible. The climate played a hidden role in shaping the civilization's character. Modern reconstructions of ancient weather patterns indicate periods of instability across the broader Near East during crucial centuries of political development. Some regions experienced declining rainfall, others suffered recurring crop failures. Migration pressures increased. Smaller kingdoms became vulnerable. In times of scarcity, competition intensified over fertile land and reliable water access. The emerging state adapted by becoming intensely militarized. Unlike civilizations protected by oceans or remote geography, this kingdom existed in an exposed environment where threats arrived regularly from multiple directions. Highland raiders descended through mountain passes, Rival rulers tested border towns, nomadic groups moved unpredictably across frontier zones. Maintaining military readiness was not simply ambition, it was necessity. This constant pressure shaped the psychology of the ruling elite. Kings presented themselves not merely as administrators, but as guardians standing between civilization and chaos. Royal imagery repeatedly emphasized order imposed upon hostile forces. Even hunting scenes carried symbolic meaning. When rulers were shown killing lions, bulls, or wild animals, the message extended beyond personal bravery. The king was demonstrating his ability to dominate dangerous nature itself. At the same time, the rivers quietly generated wealth. The agricultural base expanded steadily through irrigation improvements and organized labor systems. Grain surpluses supported larger populations. Larger populations supplied soldiers, builders, craftsmen, and administrators. Trade networks widened. Artisans produced increasingly sophisticated metalwork, ceramics, and carved objects reflecting contact with distant cultures. The civilization absorbed influences from surrounding regions, while developing a distinct political identity of its own. One lesser-known detail still fascinates historians. Some early settlements in the empire's core territory contain evidence of unusually standardized storage and ration systems compared to neighboring states of the same period. Clay ceilings, measuring devices, and administrative markings suggest a bureaucracy emerging earlier than many scholars once believed possible for the region. The evidence remains incomplete. But it increasingly appears that efficient resource management became one of the civilization's greatest hidden strengths long before its military expansion began. The frontier zones hardened these systems further. Border governors required reliable communication with the centre. Garrisons needed regular supply deliveries. Roads, though primitive at first, linked to strategic settlements across difficult terrain. Messengers travelled constantly carrying orders, intelligence reports, and tax information. Over generations, the state learned how to project authority across increasing distances. Meanwhile, neighbouring kingdoms remained fragmented. Many were wealthy but politically unstable. Others depended heavily on temporary alliances that collapsed under pressure. Some possessed impressive cities but lacked the centralised structures necessary for sustained expansion. The rising power at the centre of this story watched carefully. It learned from rivals while quietly preparing to surpass them. Archaeological discoveries reveal that warfare evolved rapidly during this period. Defensive walls became thicker, gates grew more complex, weapons production increased, horse breeding and chariot technology transformed military mobility across the Near East. Control over metal resources became increasingly critical. The kingdom expanded cautiously at first, securing nearby territories that protected trade routes and agricultural zones. Each victory brought additional manpower and revenue. But conquest also created new risks. Absorbing diverse populations required administrative innovation. Local traditions had to be managed carefully. Frontier rebellions threatened stability. Scholars still debate exactly how early rulers balanced coercion with cooperation, because surviving records heavily favour royal propaganda. What does appear clear is that the state became highly skilled at combining intimidation with practical governance. Some conquered elites were executed publicly. Others retained positions under imperial supervision. Flexibility became another imperial weapon. As the kingdom expanded, its capitals changed dramatically. Modest administrative centres evolved into monumental cities designed to impress visitors and intimidate subjects. Temples rose beside palaces decorated with relief carvings, showing military victories, tribute bearers, exotic animals, and long processions of captives. Imported materials arrived from distant regions, cedar wood from mountain forests, precious metals from foreign mines, ivory, dyed textiles, and rare stones flowed into royal workshops. The ruling class increasingly viewed itself as standing above ordinary humanity. This attitude appears vividly in surviving inscriptions. Kings describe themselves with titles that grow steadily more ambitious over time. At first, they rule cities or regions. Later, they rule lands beyond rivers, mountains, horizons. Eventually, they claim authority over the four corners of the world, a phrase repeated across centuries of imperial ideology. To modern ears, it sounds exaggerated, even theatrical. But within the ancient worldview, such claims carried political and spiritual meaning. Expansion was presented as evidence of divine favour. Yet beneath the confidence, insecurity remained constant. The empire's homeland never became naturally safe. Distant campaigns required enormous resources. Internal rivalries threatened succession. Frontier provinces demanded permanent military presence. Every gain created additional borders to defend. This produced a cycle that would define the civilization for centuries. Expansion strengthened the empire economically and politically, but it also made the state increasingly dependent on continuous military success. No single explanation fully accounts for why this particular kingdom succeeded where so many rivals failed. Geography helped, but geography alone creates no empire. Violence mattered, but countless violent states disappeared quickly. The deeper answer may lie in how effectively the civilization fused military organisation, economic management, religious ideology, and administrative control into a single system. The rivers fed that system constantly. Farmers harvested grain beneath scorching summers, while officials tracked production with obsessive precision. Labourers expanded canals that transformed dry plains into cultivated land. Caravans moved through guarded trade corridors carrying wealth into growing cities. Soldiers drilled near frontier forts where warning fires could spread messages across long distances within hours. Priests conducted rituals asking the gods to preserve cosmic order through royal authority, everything connected. And as neighbouring states struggled through cycles of instability, drought, migration, and political collapse, this kingdom became something new in the ancient world. Not merely a powerful state, but an expanding machine capable of surviving disasters that shattered its rivals. Soon, it would begin reaching beyond survival. Soon, the empire would begin remaking the ancient Near East itself. The transformation from hardened frontier kingdom to true imperial superpower did not happen in a single generation. It unfolded through a succession of rulers who inherited a dangerous world and slowly reshaped it through relentless expansion, calculated brutality, and an almost obsessive belief that security could only exist through domination. Every campaign widened the empire's horizons, every victory deepened its appetite. At first, the conquest remained regional. Neighbouring cities were subdued, border territories became provinces, trade routes once vulnerable to raids came under direct military supervision. But something changed as the state's rulers began to realise that no frontier ever remained quiet for long. One defeated enemy merely created space for another. Stability seemed temporary unless threats were destroyed far beyond the empire's borders. This logic became the engine of expansion. What survives in royal inscriptions suggests that early imperial kings viewed warfare not as an occasional necessity, but as the normal condition of rule. Years were measured by campaigns. Victories defined legitimacy. A ruler who remained inactive risked appearing weak before both nobles and rivals. Military success fed the economy, strengthened political authority, and reinforced the belief that the gods favoured conquest. The empire's armies evolved accordingly. Earlier regional forces had relied heavily on seasonal levies raised when needed. The growing empire developed something far more dangerous, a semi-professional military structure capable of operating for extended periods across enormous distances, infantry units trained systematically, chariot divisions increased mobility and shock power, engineers accompanied campaigns to construct roads, siege ramps, bridges, and fortified camps. Supply systems improved until armies could sustain operations far from the imperial core. One lesser-known detail reveals just how sophisticated this military machine became. Archaeological evidence suggests imperial officials carefully monitored horse breeding and transport logistics with extraordinary precision. Clay tablets record not only troop numbers, but fodder allocations, replacement animals, and delivery schedules across multiple provinces. Empires often collapse when supply systems fail. This civilization understood that victories depended as much on organisation as courage. The kings themselves cultivated terrifying reputations. They appeared constantly in military art, towering above enemies, drawing bows from chariots, or overseeing sieges from elevated positions. These images were not neutral historical records. They were political theatre carved into stone. Foreign ambassadors entering imperial capitals encountered walls covered in scenes of conquered cities burning beneath advancing armies. Prisoners were shown kneeling before rulers who seemed almost superhuman in scale and composure. Fear became state policy. Modern historians sometimes debate the extent to which royal accounts exaggerated imperial violence. Ancient rulers regularly amplified their achievements for propaganda purposes, and some descriptions may indeed be symbolic rather than literal. Yet archaeology confirms many campaigns ended in catastrophic destruction for defeated populations. Burn layers appear across multiple cities associated with imperial invasions. Mass graves exist near siege sites. Defensive walls show signs of violent assault. The empire wanted resistance to appear hopeless. At the same time, conquest alone could never sustain such rapid growth. The kings needed a political structure capable of holding territories together after armies moved on. This became one of the empire's most remarkable achievements. Rather than simply demanding tribute and withdrawing, rulers installed governors, created administrative districts, and integrated conquered regions into an expanding bureaucratic network. Roads spread outward from the imperial heartland like arteries. Messengers carried orders between provinces with astonishing speed for the ancient world. Garrisons secured strategic crossings and mountain routes. Tax systems extracted grain, livestock, metals, timber, and labour from conquered territories. In some areas, local rulers remained in place under imperial supervision. In others, populations were forcibly relocated. The deportations became infamous. Entire communities were moved hundreds of miles away from their homelands. To later generations, this policy appeared extraordinarily cruel, and often it was. Families vanished from ancestral regions forever. Languages and traditions fractured. But from the empire's perspective, mass relocation solved several problems simultaneously. Rebellious populations lost regional power bases. Skilled labour could be redirected towards strategic cities. Newly conquered territories became easier to control when communities were mixed together. Scholars still debate the precise scale of these deportations, but surviving records suggest they involved enormous numbers of people over centuries of imperial expansion. What makes the policy especially striking is its administrative complexity. Organising forced migrations across difficult terrain required planning, supply coordination, and detailed record-keeping on a scale few ancient states could manage. The empire increasingly resembled a machine built to process conquest itself. His rulers also understood symbolism with remarkable sophistication. New capitals were constructed not merely as political centres, but as demonstrations of universal power. Palaces expanded into sprawling complexes filled with carved reliefs, imported luxury goods, sacred spaces, administrative archives, and ceremonial courtyards capable of hosting massive gatherings. Foreign tribute arrived in elaborate processions. Exotic animals appeared in royal menageries. Precious materials from distant regions decorated walls and furniture. Visitors entering these capitals encountered a carefully designed world intended to overwhelm the senses. Towering guardian figures stood beside gates. Winged creatures carved from stone watched over entrances. Walls depicted endless victories. The architecture itself communicated permanence. Whether subjects loved the empire mattered less than whether they believed resistance was impossible. Meanwhile, the kings pushed farther outward. Campaigns reached mountains rich in metals and forests. Armies crossed rivers into wealthy urban regions long contested by rival powers. Desert trade corridors came under imperial control. Smaller kingdoms faced impossible choices: submit peacefully, pay tribute, or risk annihilation. Some resisted anyway. Others surrendered before battles even began. Yet even at the height of expansion, dangers multiplied beneath the surface. The empire's scale created constant pressure on its rulers. Vast territories required enormous military expenditures. Succession disputes threatened stability whenever a king died unexpectedly. Governors in distant provinces occasionally grew too powerful. Frontier wars drained manpower. Droughts and failed harvests still endangered agricultural production, despite sophisticated irrigation systems. No empire, however strong, escapes the mathematics of overextension forever. There were also signs that the civilization's culture itself was changing under the weight of conquest. Earlier rulers had emerged from a relatively compact homeland shaped by shared traditions and common threats. Now the empire governed millions of people speaking different languages, worshipping different gods, and carrying memories of violent subjugation. Maintaining unity required constant displays of authority. The kings responded by elevating royal ideology to almost cosmic levels. In inscriptions, rulers described themselves as chosen by divine forces to maintain order across the known world. Military victories became evidence of sacred legitimacy. Defeat, therefore, threatened more than territory. It threatened the entire ideological foundation of empire. This may help explain the extraordinary intensity of imperial warfare during later periods. Retreat became psychologically difficult for rulers whose authority depended on perpetual success. Campaigns continued even when risks increased. Enemies were pursued across brutal terrain. Rebellions were crushed with escalating severity. And still the empire expanded. To distant peoples, it must have seemed unstoppable. Messengers carried stories of armies appearing suddenly beyond mountains or deserts once considered natural barriers. Frontier cities watched smoke rise from neighbouring kingdoms already destroyed. Refugees arrived with tales of colossal siege engines, deportations, executions, and endless columns of soldiers marching beneath royal standards. But beneath the victories lay hidden fragility. The empire had become dependent on motion. Its economy relied heavily on tribute, labour extraction, and military success. Its political legitimacy depended on powerful kings capable of commanding fear. Its borders stretched farther each decade across increasingly unstable regions. For the moment, however, none of that seemed to matter. From the perspective of the ancient world, the superpower appeared invincible. Its capitals glittered with wealth gathered from conquered lands. Its rulers spoke as masters of the earth itself. Its armies moved with terrifying discipline from one horizon to another, and beyond the empire's expanding borders, entire civilizations began reshaping their own futures around a single fact. The giant in the river plains was coming closer. The empire did not merely conquer territory, it built cities designed to make conquest feel eternal. Across the ancient Near East, travellers approaching imperial capitals saw something unlike the crowded urban centres of older civilizations. The cities of rival kingdoms often grew gradually over centuries, shaped by trade, local geography, and accumulated habit. The imperial capitals were different. They felt imposed upon the landscape with deliberate force, as though rulers intended to redesign reality itself. Massive walls rose from plains that had once held farmland or scattered settlements. Artificial terraces elevated palaces high above ordinary neighbourhoods. Roads widened into ceremonial avenues capable of carrying military processions. Tribute caravans, foreign envoys, prisoners, livestock, and endless streams of labourers. Water systems redirected rivers and canals through engineered landscapes where gardens flourished in climates that should barely have supported them. The cities became physical expressions of imperial ideology. One ruler after another founded or expanded capitals to celebrate victories and display wealth gathered from distant territories. These were not simply administrative centres. They were carefully staged environments where architecture, sculpture, ritual, and political authority merged into a single overwhelming experience. Even today, their ruins retain traces of that ambition. Archaeologists walking through collapsed palace complexes still encounter halls so vast that modern visitors struggle to imagine them roofed and active with life. Stone reliefs line walls for enormous distances, depicting military campaigns, hunts, tribute processions, and ritual scenes in astonishing detail. Some carvings remain sharp after more than 2,000 years. Muscles strain beneath armoured soldiers. Rivers swirl around drowning enemies. Foreign animals stand tethered before the throne. The message appears everywhere: the empire controls all things worth possessing. The capitals also reveal how deeply conquest shaped daily life at the centre of power. Imported materials arrive continuously from conquered lands. Cedar beams from distant mountains supported roofs above royal chambers. Ivory from far southern regions decorated furniture and ceremonial objects. Gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and dyed textiles flowed into workshops where craftsmen from multiple cultures worked side by side under imperial supervision. What survives in the record suggests these cities were intensely cosmopolitan places despite their militarized atmosphere. Deportation policies brought skilled artisans, scribes, builders, and laborers from across the empire into the capitals. Languages mixed in markets. Religious traditions overlapped. Foreign styles appeared in art and architecture. The empire absorbed cultures even while dominating them. One lesser-known detail reveals the extraordinary complexity of these urban centres. Excavations in palace archives have uncovered administrative tablets recording astonishingly specific distributions of food, wine, oil, livestock, and textiles to workers, officials, soldiers, and religious personnel. Some lists track deliveries down to individual groups of craftsmen or palace servants. The bureaucracy extended into nearly every aspect of urban life. The scale of labour required to sustain the capitals was immense. Thousands of workers maintained canals, roads, gardens, defensive walls, temples, and storage facilities. Grain from provincial farms fed urban populations that may have reached sizes unprecedented for the region at certain periods. Royal workshops produced weapons, luxury goods, ceremonial objects, and diplomatic gifts continuously. The empire's cities consumed resources at staggering rates. And yet they were also strangely fragile. Many imperial capitals were built quickly by rulers eager to establish personal legacies. Entire populations were relocated to populate newly founded cities. Construction projects expanded at astonishing speed. Palaces rose in decades rather than centuries. This created spectacular urban landscapes, but sometimes at enormous financial and logistical cost. Scholars still debate whether certain construction programs strained the empire's resources during critical periods. The rulers themselves lived within environments designed to reinforce separation from ordinary humanity. Palace complexes contained restricted courtyards, throne rooms, private apartments, sacred spaces, gardens, and administrative wings guarded by layers of security. Foreign envoys passed through carefully controlled sequences of gates and halls before reaching the king. Every step reinforced hierarchy. Even the colossal guardian figures standing beside palace entrances carried political meaning. Winged bulls and lion-bodied beings with human heads projected supernatural protection and royal authority simultaneously. To modern viewers, they appear artistic and symbolic. To ancient visitors, they may have felt genuinely intimidating. Their size alone suggested a civilization operating beyond normal human scale. Outside the palace walls, however, ordinary life continued in crowded districts filled with merchants, craftsmen, soldiers, labourers, priests, servants, and families drawn from across the empire. The cities smelled of smoke, livestock, mud brick, sweat, cooked grain, and river water. Workshops rang with hammering metal and carved stone. Scribes copied records onto clay tablets while traders argued over shipments arriving from distant provinces. The empire's urban sophistication often surprises modern audiences because later, historical traditions emphasized its brutality more than its administrative or cultural achievements. Yet these capitals contained libraries, observatories, engineering systems, and artistic traditions of remarkable complexity. Scholars recorded astronomical events with impressive accuracy. Medical texts circulated among educated elites. Royal archives preserved diplomatic correspondence spanning multiple kingdoms and languages. Some of the most important discoveries emerged accidentally. In several major palace sites, invading armies destroyed upper floors during later collapses. Roofs fell onto archives below, trapping and baking clay tablets in intense heat. The same fires that annihilated parts of the cities unintentionally preserved records for thousands of years. Without those catastrophes, much of the empire's memory would have dissolved back into earth. The capitals also exposed the contradictions at the centre of imperial power. The empire celebrated order, yet depended on continuous warfare. It projected permanence, yet many of its greatest cities were occupied for surprisingly short periods before rulers shifted attention elsewhere. It gathered wealth from across enormous territories, yet required endless military pressure to sustain those flows of tribute and labour. No single explanation fully accounts for why rulers repeatedly built new capitals instead of simply expanding older ones. Some scholars believe political symbolism played the largest role. Founding a new city allowed kings to associate themselves personally with imperial grandeur. Others point to strategic concerns, internal rivalries, or environmental pressures. The evidence remains incomplete. What is certain is that these cities reshaped how power looked in the ancient world. Foreign emissaries arriving from smaller kingdoms encountered urban landscapes specifically designed to communicate inevitability. Towering walls, endless relief carvings, disciplined guards, massive storage facilities, and orchestrated ceremonies all reinforced the same idea: resistance was temporary. Empire was permanent. For a time, many believed it. Yet buried within the capitals were warnings of future disaster. Their dependence on centralized authority made them vulnerable during political crises. Their enormous populations required stable food supplies and secure transportation networks. Their grandeur concealed the constant strain necessary to maintain imperial order, and perhaps most dangerous of all, the empire's rulers increasingly believed their own image of invincibility. Victories accumulated, wealth multiplied, new provinces submitted, The capitals expanded into landscapes of extraordinary confidence. Kings commissioned monuments celebrating campaigns farther and farther from the imperial heartland. The world seemed to bend toward imperial control, but beyond the palace walls and carved propaganda, the frontiers never stopped moving. New enemies studied the empire carefully, subject peoples remembered old grievances, climate patterns shifted unpredictably across vulnerable regions, trade routes fluctuated, ambitious generals watched aging kings, the capitals shone brilliantly at the height of imperial power, and like many cities built on conquest, they were already carrying the seeds of their own destruction. At the centre of the empire's rise stood an army unlike anything many neighbouring kingdoms had ever faced before. Earlier civilizations fought wars seasonally, gathering temporary forces from farmers and local nobles whenever conflict erupted. The imperial military evolved into something colder, more organised, and far more relentless. It became a permanent instrument of state power, capable of operating across deserts, mountains, forests, and river valleys with terrifying efficiency. The empire's enemies often saw the army long before they encountered it directly. Dust clouds appeared on distant horizons. Scouts vanished. Refugees fled ahead of advancing columns carrying stories of burned towns and shattered fortresses. Then came the sound. Thousands of boots moving in rhythm, wagons creaking beneath supplies, horses snorting under armoured riders, metal striking metal as weapons and tools shifted during the march. Ancient warfare was chaotic and brutal, but this military increasingly resembled a machine. What survives in relief carvings and military records suggests astonishing levels of organisation for the ancient world. Infantry units carried standardised weapons and equipment. Archers operated alongside shield-bearing troops trained to advance in coordinated formations. Engineers travelled with the army constructing bridges, siege ramps, portable towers, and fortified camps. Specialised labourers cleared roads and managed logistics behind the front lines. One lesser-known detail still impresses military historians today. Some surviving administrative tablets indicate imperial officials tracked not only troop movements, but also water access points, fodder requirements, road conditions, and seasonal terrain changes across campaign regions. Armies often fail because of supply collapse rather than battlefield defeat. The empire's commanders appear to have understood this deeply. The soldiers themselves came from many backgrounds. Early armies drew heavily from the empire's core territories, but expansion transformed recruitment patterns. Conquered peoples were integrated into the military system in various ways. Some served as auxiliary troops skilled in regional fighting styles, others provided cavalry, archers, engineers, or naval forces. The empire adapted foreign techniques rapidly, absorbing useful innovations from defeated enemies without hesitation. This flexibility became one of its greatest strengths. In battle, the army combined intimidation with practical efficiency. Siege warfare in particular reached extraordinary levels of sophistication. Many ancient cities relied on massive walls for protection, assuming attackers would eventually lose supplies or morale. Imperial forces approached sieges methodically. Engineers undermined foundations, constructed ramps, deployed battering devices, and cut off water access where possible. Archers maintained constant pressure while infantry advanced behind shields. The psychological dimension mattered just as much as the physical assault. Royal inscriptions describe defeated cities in vivid and often horrifying detail. Scholars still debate which accounts were exaggerated propaganda and which reflected reality. But there is little doubt the empire intentionally cultivated fear as a strategic weapon. News of brutal punishment spread rapidly through trade networks and refugee populations. Some cities surrendered immediately rather than risk resistance. The empire encouraged that reputation. Relief carvings displayed conquered enemies in humiliating positions. Royal texts described rebellious rulers being captured, executed, or publicly displayed. The intention was not random cruelty alone. It was deterrence. The empire wanted neighbouring states to calculate resistance as irrational, and often they did. Yet the military system depended on more than terror. It required discipline maintained over enormous distances and long periods of time. Campaigns sometimes lasted months or years across harsh terrain. Soldiers crossed rivers in flood, climbed mountain passes, and marched through regions where heat, disease, and exhaustion killed as effectively as enemy weapons. The empire's logistical networks made these operations possible. Road systems expanded constantly to support military mobility. Supply depots stored grain, weapons, tools, and animal fodder at strategic intervals. Garrisons secured communication lines between provinces. Messengers travelled with extraordinary speed, carrying intelligence reports and royal commands across the empire. Some historians argue these communication systems were among the civilization's most revolutionary achievements, though the evidence remains incomplete in certain regions. The army also reshaped the empire socially. Military success became one of the clearest paths to prestige and advancement. Elite officers gained wealth through campaigns and royal favour. Conquered lands provided tribute, slaves, livestock, metals, and agricultural resources feeding both the state and military aristocracy. The empire increasingly organised itself around warfare not merely as defence, but as an economic system. This created dangerous momentum. Victories funded further expansion. Expansion demanded larger armies. Larger armies required greater taxation and tribute extraction. Over time, the empire became dependent on maintaining military dominance simply to sustain its own structure. The kings understood the risks, but they also understood the rewards. Royal campaigns projected authority far beyond the battlefield. Every successful invasion reinforced the ruler's image as chosen by divine forces to maintain order in a violent world. Defeat threatened not only territory, but political legitimacy itself. As a result, military campaigns became deeply tied to imperial identity. Some of the empire's most striking artistic works reveal this mentality clearly. Palace reliefs often show the king calm and composed amid scenes of overwhelming violence. Enemies drown in rivers or collapse beneath chariot wheels, while the ruler remains almost unnaturally serene. These images were carefully constructed. They transformed warfare into theatre where imperial victory appeared inevitable. But reality was never so simple. Even the empire's greatest armies faced setbacks. Mountain tribes resisted occupation stubbornly. Desert campaigns strained supply lines. Rebellions erupted repeatedly in conquered regions. Frontier enemies learned from imperial tactics and adapted their own defences. Some victories came at tremendous cost. Archaeological evidence reveals the physical toll carried by soldiers. Skeletal remains from military contexts show healed fractures, arrow wounds, joint damage, and signs of extreme physical stress. Ancient warfare demanded brutal endurance. Many soldiers likely spent years far from home moving through landscapes of constant danger. There were also limits to imperial control. The farther armies travelled from the heartland, the harder provinces became to manage. Garrisons required steady supplies. Governors demanded reinforcements during unrest. Harsh punishments suppressed rebellion temporarily, but often deepened resentment over time. Some conquered populations cooperated with the empire pragmatically. Others waited generations for opportunities to revolt. No single explanation fully accounts for how the empire maintained such extensive military dominance for so long. Superior organisation mattered. Psychological warfare mattered. Economic resources mattered. Geography mattered. But perhaps the deepest advantage lay in the civilization's willingness to adapt continuously. The empire borrowed technologies, tactics, and administrative methods from many cultures while binding them into an increasingly centralized system. Still, beneath the appearance of unstoppable force, cracks were beginning to form. The military machine consumed enormous resources. Constant warfare exhausted populations. Provincial governors accumulated dangerous influence. Rival factions emerged within the royal court. Succession disputes threatened stability whenever strong rulers weakened or died. For the moment, however, the empire's armies remained the most feared force in the known world. Across frontier regions, watchtowers scanned horizons for approaching columns. Smaller kingdoms reinforced walls and gathered tribute payments. Traders whispered rumours of new campaigns moving toward distant rivers and mountain passes. Entire populations calculated survival around imperial expansion, and in the capitals, kings continued commissioning reliefs that showed the same eternal message carved into stone again and again. The empire marches forward. Everyone else survives if permitted. The empire's armies conquered territories, but conquest alone could never sustain the enormous system rising across the ancient world. Behind every military campaign stood a vast economic network, extracting resources from rivers, farms, mines, forests, workshops, and conquered populations on a scale few earlier civilizations had ever attempted. The empire did not simply take wealth. It reorganized entire regions to feed itself continuously. From the royal capitals, administrators tracked tribute flowing inward from distant provinces like blood returning to a heart. Grain arrived in staggering quantities from fertile river valleys. Timber came down from mountain forests stripped to support construction and shipbuilding. Precious metals moved along guarded trade routes beside livestock, wine, oil, textiles, stone, ivory, and weapons. Every conquest widened the empire's appetite. The logistical complexity was extraordinary. Archaeologists excavating administrative archives continue uncovering tablets listing taxes, labour obligations, inventory records, and shipment schedules with astonishing precision. Some documents track livestock deliveries by species and age. Others record distributions of grain rations to workers and soldiers. Officials monitored storage facilities, canal repairs, agricultural yields, and caravan routes constantly. What survives in the records suggests a bureaucracy operating at a sophistication that still surprises historians. One lesser-known detail reveals how deeply the empire depended on organisation. In several provincial centres, excavations have uncovered standardised weighing systems and administrative seals nearly identical to those used hundreds of miles away in the imperial core. This implies not merely regional influences, but a deliberate effort to create uniform economic control across enormous territories. The empire's wealth began with agriculture. The fertile river systems at the centre of imperial territory produced large grain surpluses through irrigation networks expanded over generations. Canals redirected water into fields that otherwise could not sustain dense populations. Maintaining these systems required endless labour. Mud had to be dredged constantly, embankments repaired after floods, water disputes settled by officials. In many ways, the empire's true foundation was not military glory, but controlled water. Farmers carried much of the burden. Most people living under imperial rule never saw palace walls or distant military campaigns directly. Their world revolved around fields, irrigation canals, livestock, taxes, seasonal labour obligations, and local officials. Yet even remote villages became tied into imperial systems through tribute collection and administrative oversight. Grain harvested in one region might feed soldiers campaigning hundreds of miles away. The state extracted resources aggressively, but it also invested in infrastructure that increased long-term productivity. Roads improved trade efficiency, canal systems expanded agriculture, secure trade corridors allowed merchants to travel more safely than during earlier centuries of regional instability. Some provinces prospered significantly under imperial administration, at least during periods of stability. This created one of the empire's central contradictions. To conquered peoples, imperial rule could feel both oppressive and materially beneficial at the same time. Taxes were heavy, rebellions were punished harshly, deportation shattered communities, yet imperial security also reduced some forms of local warfare and banditry that had devastated trade in earlier periods. Markets expanded, goods circulated across larger regions, cities connected to imperial routes often grew rapidly. Trade became one of the empire's hidden sources of power. Caravans crossed deserts carrying metals, textiles, spices, incense, ceramics, and luxury goods from astonishing distances. River transport moved heavy cargo efficiently between major urban centres. Ports linked inland territories to maritime exchange networks reaching far beyond imperial borders. Foreign merchants arrived in the capitals bringing rare commodities and information from other civilizations. The empire absorbed both eagerly. Royal workshops transformed imported materials into objects of extraordinary craftsmanship. Ivory carvings, jewellery, ceremonial weapons, decorated furniture, and intricate metalwork filled palace storerooms. Kings displayed foreign tribute publicly during ceremonies, surrounding themselves with evidence that the world's wealth flowed toward imperial authority. But beneath the displays of abundance lay enormous human cost. Labour systems depended heavily on coercion. Conquered populations supplied workers for construction projects, agriculture, military service, and state workshops. Some laboured seasonally under tax obligations. Others arrived through forced deportations following military campaigns. Massive palace complexes, roads, canals, and fortifications demanded constant manpower. The empire consumed people as relentlessly as it consumed resources. Scholars still debate exactly how living conditions varied across social classes, because surviving records overwhelmingly reflect elite perspectives. What seems clear is that ordinary labourers experienced lives shaped by exhausting work, taxation, and vulnerability to environmental instability. Droughts, crop failures, disease outbreaks, or military disruptions could push communities into crisis quickly. Climate fluctuations posed constant danger. Modern environmental studies suggest parts of the Near East experienced periods of ecological stress during key phases of imperial expansion. Deforestation increased around heavily populated centres. Irrigation sometimes caused soil salinisation that reduced agricultural productivity over time. Drought cycles disrupted harvests unpredictably. No single explanation fully accounts for how environmental pressures affected imperial stability. But the evidence increasingly suggests nature quietly strained the system beneath its surface grandeur. The ruling elite remained intensely aware of these risks. Royal inscriptions constantly emphasise abundance, fertility, and divine favour, partly because scarcity haunted the ancient world so persistently. A failed harvest could trigger unrest. Disrupted trade routes could weaken frontier defences. Economic collapse often arrived gradually before becoming catastrophic. The empire attempted to control uncertainty through administration. Governors monitored provinces, officials tracked inventories obsessively, state granaries stored emergency reserves, communication systems allowed rulers to respond to crises faster than many earlier civilizations could manage. Yet complexity itself created vulnerability. The larger the empire grew, the harder coordination became, and still the machine expanded. Conquered territories funded new campaigns. New campaigns produced additional tribute and labour. Palaces grew larger, armies grew stronger, cities consumed more resources. Imperial confidence deepened with every successful generation. Foreign observers saw only the surface. They saw colossal capitals filled with wealth from across the known world. They saw armies moving through conquered lands with disciplined precision. They saw kings receiving tribute from distant peoples beneath towering palace walls. The empire appeared limitless, but internally, pressure accumulated everywhere. Provincial elites competed for influence. Frontier regions demanded constant military spending. Agricultural systems required endless maintenance. Deportations destabilized local economies even while strengthening imperial centres. Wealth concentrated heavily around the court and military aristocracy. Some conquered populations cooperated reluctantly. Others nurtured quiet hatred across generations. Even trade carried hidden dangers. The same routes that transported wealth also spread disease, unrest, foreign ideas, and intelligence about imperial weaknesses. Frontier enemies learned where supply systems were vulnerable. Rival powers studied imperial methods carefully. Economic integration created dependencies that could unravel during periods of instability. Yet for now, the empire remained astonishingly successful. Its roads connected landscapes once divided by conflict and distance. Its markets contained goods gathered from mountains, deserts, forests, and coasts separated by enormous stretches of territory. Its administrators coordinated systems of taxation and labour across populations numbering in the millions. Its rulers projected confidence so overwhelming that later civilizations would remember them less as human kings than as near mythic conquerors. And somewhere beneath the triumphal inscriptions and endless flows of tribute, another truth slowly emerged. The empire had become too large to survive without constant motion. If the conquest stopped, the machinery holding everything together might begin to fail. The empire's rulers did not believe they governed through military strength alone. Armies could conquer cities, collect tribute, and crush rebellions, but no empire survives long by force alone. To rule millions across vast territories filled with different languages, gods, and traditions, the kings needed something larger than fear. They needed a cosmic explanation for why their authority existed at all. So the empire wrapped itself in the language of divine order. In the great capitals, temples rose beside palaces as if political and sacred power were inseparable parts of the same structure. Priests performed rituals before campaigns. Omens were studied obsessively. Celestial events were recorded with anxious precision. Eclipses, unusual weather, animal behaviour, and dreams could all be interpreted as messages from the gods regarding the fate of the empire. What survives in the record suggests the ruling elite lived in constant awareness of supernatural risk. Modern audiences sometimes imagine ancient empires as confidently religious, but the reality was often more uneasy. The kings projected certainty publicly, yet their archives reveal extraordinary concern about divine displeasure. Court scholars and priests examined liver patterns from sacrificed animals, tracked planetary movements, and preserved extensive collections of omens attempting to predict future disasters. The universe itself appeared unstable to them. One lesser-known detail reveals just how elaborate this system became. Some surviving tablets contain thousands of omen interpretations cataloguing possible meanings behind natural events. A lunar eclipse might signal rebellion in one province, but prosperity in another depending on timing, direction, and surrounding celestial conditions. Scholars still debate how literally rulers believed these predictions, but there is little doubt such rituals deeply influenced political decision-making. Religion also reinforced hierarchy. The king stood at the centre of the empire's relationship with the divine world. He was not usually worshipped as a god in the same way some earlier rulers elsewhere had been, but he was presented as uniquely chosen and protected by supernatural forces. Royal inscriptions repeatedly describe kings as favoured by the gods to impose order upon rebellious lands and chaotic peoples. Military victory became sacred evidence. When campaigns succeeded, rulers attributed triumph to divine support. Captured cities proved the gods approved imperial expansion. Defeat, however, created dangerous questions. If the empire lost battles or suffered disasters, had the gods withdrawn favour? Had rituals been neglected? Had rulers become corrupt? This anxiety shaped imperial behaviour constantly. Before campaigns, priests conducted elaborate ceremonies asking for guidance and protection. During crises, rulers sometimes ordered mass rituals intended to restore cosmic balance. Temples received enormous wealth through donations of land, livestock, labour, and tribute. Sacred festivals reinforced loyalty by linking imperial prosperity to divine order itself. The capitals became stages for these performances of sacred power. Massive temple complexes dominated urban skylines beside royal palaces. Processions carried sacred statues through ceremonial routes lined with crowds. Musicians, priests, officials, soldiers, and servants participated in carefully choreographed rituals connecting ordinary people to imperial ideology. Even architecture reinforced the message. Towering gates, elevated terraces, and colossal sculptures made humans feel physically small before the forces ruling their world. Yet the empire's religion was not entirely unified. As conquest expanded, imperial authorities encountered countless local gods and sacred traditions. Instead of destroying every foreign belief system, the empire often absorbed or adapted them. Provincial temples sometimes remained active under imperial supervision. Foreign deities appeared in royal inscriptions alongside older state gods. Sacred symbols blended across regions. This flexibility helped maintain stability. Conquered peoples might resent taxation and military occupation, but allowing certain local religious practices reduced resistance. The empire understood that belief could not always be crushed directly. Sometimes it was more useful to incorporate it into imperial structure. At the same time, rulers remained careful never to appear subordinate to provincial traditions. The imperial gods always stood above others. The king always remained central. Religion served political order first. Some of the empire's most haunting discoveries come from ritual contexts. Archaeologists have uncovered temple rooms filled with offerings left untouched for thousands of years after sudden destruction. Burned incense containers remain where priests abandoned them during invasions. Sacred figurines lie buried beneath collapsed walls. In some cases, desperate rituals appear to have intensified during the empire's final decades as rulers confronted growing instability. The deeper scholars study these records, the clearer it becomes that the empire's leaders genuinely feared unseen forces. This fear partly explains the intensity of royal symbolism. Kings surrounded themselves with protective imagery constantly. Winged guardian figures stood beside palace gates. Sacred animals appeared in relief carvings and ceremonial art. Protective inscriptions covered walls and foundations. Ritual specialists advised rulers on everything from warfare to palace construction. No single explanation fully accounts for how much religion shaped actual political decisions, because ancient rulers rarely separated practical and spiritual thinking, the way modern societies often do. For them, droughts, invasions, disease outbreaks, eclipses, and rebellions existed simultaneously as material and divine events, and troubling signs were beginning to appear. As the empire expanded farther from its homeland, maintaining ideological unity became increasingly difficult. Different provinces followed different traditions. Local elites cooperated publicly, while privately preserving older loyalties. Frontier populations viewed imperial gods as foreign powers imposed alongside taxes and soldiers. Even within the imperial core, tensions emerged. Royal succession remained dangerously unstable. When powerful kings died, rival claimants competed fiercely for authority. Priest and court officials interpreted omens differently depending on political alliances. Some rulers launched massive building programs partly to demonstrate continued divine favour during uncertain periods. Meanwhile, ordinary people faced growing hardship beneath the surface grandeur. Taxation intensified to support armies, palaces, temples, and infrastructure. Agricultural pressures mounted in some regions. Labour obligations consumed lives across generations. What appeared as sacred imperial order from palace courtyards could feel very different in struggling villages far from the capital. Yet public ceremonies continued projecting confidence. Kings stood beneath towering statues receiving tribute from conquered peoples, while priests declared divine approval. Armies marched beneath sacred standards blessed before battle. Foreign envoys entered halls where every image reinforced the same message the empire ruled because the gods themselves demanded it. For a time, many believed this completely. But history contains a quiet pattern repeated across civilizations. The more rulers insist their authority is eternal and divinely protected, the more catastrophic their eventual collapse appears when it finally arrives. The empire's religious system gave it strength, legitimacy, and cohesion across centuries of expansion. It also made the civilization psychologically vulnerable. If disaster came on too large a scale, the entire sacred foundation supporting imperial rule could fracture at once. And beyond the ceremonies, omens, and palace rituals, the world was changing in dangerous ways. Frontiers were growing unstable, rival powers were adapting, trade routes fluctuated, climate pressures deepened across vulnerable regions. Subject populations carried generations of resentment beneath forced loyalty. The priests continued studying eclipses and sacrificial signs beneath temple roofs glowing in torchlight. But no omen could fully prepare the empire for what was slowly approaching from beyond its borders. For centuries after the empire's fall, many of the strongest surviving descriptions came not from its own people, but from those who feared it, hated it, resisted it, or barely survived its expansion. The empire had carved its victories into palace walls and royal inscriptions, but conquest leaves memories in conquered lands as well. Those memories endure differently. They become stories of terror whispered across generations, warnings embedded in religious traditions, fragments preserved by enemies who measured time according to invasions and destruction. This is one reason the empire later appeared almost monstrous in historical memory. Neighbouring civilizations described armies descending suddenly upon fortified cities with overwhelming force. Refugees carried accounts of deportations, sieges, burned temples, and rulers humiliated before foreign crowds. Entire regions reorganized their defenses around the expectation that imperial expansion would eventually reach them. The empire understood exactly how useful those stories could be. Fear often conquered territory before armies arrived. Royal inscriptions amplified this deliberately. Captured rulers were described in humiliating terms. Rebellions were answered with spectacles intended to discourage future resistance. Modern historians remain cautious about accepting every imperial claim literally because ancient propaganda exaggerated constantly. But the consistency of hostile accounts across multiple neighbouring cultures suggests the empire's reputation for brutality was not entirely invented. One lesser-known detail appears in surviving correspondence from smaller kingdoms trapped between rival powers. Some rulers spent enormous effort trying to predict imperial campaigns years in advance, because resisting directly seemed hopeless. Diplomatic letters reveal frantic attempts to secure alliances, tribute agreements, or defensive arrangements before imperial armies appeared near their borders. The empire became a geopolitical force shaping decisions far beyond territories it directly controlled. The psychological weight of imperial expansion spread across the ancient world. Cities reinforced walls, frontier settlements relocated to defensible terrain, trade routes shifted away from unstable regions, refugee populations carried stories into distant lands, sometimes exaggerating events, sometimes preserving surprisingly accurate details. The empire's enemies often portrayed its kings not merely as human rulers, but as destructive forces almost beyond ordinary political understanding. Religious traditions absorbed these fears as well. In some neighbouring cultures, imperial invasions became tied to themes of divine punishment, apocalypse, or cosmic disorder. Sacred texts written long after particular campaigns still carry echoes of trauma caused by conquest. Burned cities and shattered kingdoms leave marks not only in archaeology, but in collective memory. At the same time, the empire's enemies also admired aspects of its power reluctantly. Rival states copied military tactics, administrative methods, and defensive systems developed in response to imperial pressure. Fortification styles changed, communication networks improved. Some kingdoms centralized authority more aggressively precisely because surviving near the empire required stronger internal organization. The superpower reshaped neighboring civilizations even where it failed to conquer them permanently. Archaeological evidence reveals this influence clearly. Frontier regions, once characterized by fragmented local politics, gradually adopted larger defensive structures and more coordinated governance after repeated contact with imperial expansion. In some cases, former enemies later incorporated imperial technologies and administrative ideas into their own states. History rarely divides civilizations cleanly into victims and conquerors. Many subject peoples eventually served within the empire's military and bureaucracy. Local elites cooperated pragmatically to preserve wealth and status. Traders benefited from expanded imperial stability across certain routes. Some conquered cities prospered economically after integration into imperial networks despite the violence surrounding conquest itself. This complexity often disappears in later memory. After the empire collapsed, rival civilizations inherited both trauma and opportunity. Former subject states rewrote history to emphasize imperial cruelty, while minimizing how deeply interconnected they had become with the system. Later rulers preferred narratives where the fallen empire appeared uniquely evil rather than structurally influential. Scholars still debate how much of the empire's terrifying image resulted from deliberate later exaggeration. Some ancient accounts almost certainly amplified atrocities to serve political or religious agendas, yet archaeology repeatedly confirms widespread destruction layers associated with imperial campaigns. Burned palaces, shattered fortifications, abandoned settlements, and evidence of mass population displacement appear across multiple regions. The evidence remains incomplete, but the broad pattern is unmistakable. The empire ruled through a combination of organization, intimidation, and carefully staged violence powerful enough to reshape the psychology of neighboring societies for generations. Even its artistic style carried political force. Foreign envoys entering imperial capitals encountered walls covered with scenes of submission and conquest. The imagery followed recognizable patterns. Captives kneel before kings, enemy cities collapse beneath assault. Imperial soldiers advance in disciplined formations while rulers remain calm and towering above the chaos. These carvings were not merely historical records. They were strategic messaging directed at anyone entering the court. The empire wanted visitors to internalize helplessness, and yet beneath the fear, there were moments when neighboring peoples recognized weakness emerging within the giant itself. Frontier rebellions grew more frequent during certain reigns. Rival powers occasionally defeated imperial armies or disrupted trade routes. Subject populations revolted when central authority weakened during succession crises. No empire appears invincible from the perspective of those living along unstable borders year after year. Some of the most revealing evidence comes from letters written by governors and local rulers during periods of unrest. They describe shortages, delayed reinforcements, uncertain loyalties, and growing fear that imperial control was weakening. Even before final collapse, cracks became visible to careful observers, but large empires often appear strongest shortly before they begin unravelling. The capitals remained magnificent. Tribute continued flowing inward. Kings still commissioned monuments celebrating victories. Armies still marched across frontiers carrying imperial banners. To distant populations, the superpower continued looking eternal. Meanwhile, resentment accumulated quietly across generations. Families remembered deportations. Cities remembered massacres. Local traditions survived beneath imposed administration. Subject peoples adapted outwardly while preserving older identities internally. Conquered regions waited for moments of weakness that might never come until suddenly they did. No single explanation fully accounts for why the empire inspired such enduring hostility in historical memory, compared to some other ancient powers equally capable of violence. Part of the answer may lie in its honesty. Unlike later civilizations that cloaked conquest in softer language, the empire often depicted domination openly and proudly. Its kings wanted the world to fear them. The world obliged. Centuries later, even after the capitals lay buried beneath dust and later kingdoms occupied former imperial territories, the memory lingered. Ancient writers continued describing the superpower as a warning about arrogance, cruelty, and the instability of earthly power. In some traditions, the empire became less a historical state than a symbol of overwhelming domination itself, and still, much of the empire's own voice remained lost beneath ruins. Its enemies preserved fragments coloured by fear and hatred. Later civilizations rewrote narratives to suit their own legitimacy. Entire archives vanished in fires and collapses. Languages faded. Capitals disappeared beneath changing landscapes. What survived was incomplete. But somewhere beneath those distorted memories lay a more unsettling truth. The civilization terrifying the ancient world was already beginning to fear its own future. Empires rarely collapse without warning. Long before cities burn and dynasties vanish, quieter failures begin spreading beneath the surface of power. In the case of this ancient superpower, the signs appeared gradually, almost invisibly at first, hidden behind military victories, monumental construction, and carefully staged displays of confidence. The empire continued looking enormous from the outside, even as internal strain deepened year after year. The machine had become too complex to rest. Every conquest created new provinces requiring governors, garrisons, roads, tax systems, and constant supervision. Frontier wars demanded enormous resources. Armies had to be supplied across increasingly distant territories, where climate, geography, and local politics varied dramatically. Royal courts consumed staggering wealth, while expecting uninterrupted flows of tribute from lands that often hated imperial rule. And still, the kings expanded. What survives in administrative records suggests growing pressure throughout the imperial system during later centuries. Provincial officials complained about instability. Military correspondence became more urgent. Some regions experienced recurring rebellions requiring repeated intervention. Scholars still debate whether these crises reflected temporary disruption or deeper structural weakness. But the evidence increasingly points toward a civilization struggling to maintain the scale it had achieved. Succession became one of the empire's greatest dangers. Strong rulers could temporarily hold the system together through military success and personal authority. Weak or disputed successions exposed how dependent the empire had become on centralized control. Rival princes competed for power. Court factions formed around military commanders, priests, and aristocratic families. Governors in distant provinces sometimes delayed loyalty until outcomes became clear. These political struggles weakened the empire in ways difficult to measure archaeologically, but impossible to ignore historically. When kings fought for the throne, armies that should have guarded frontiers turned inward. Resources vanished into civil conflict. Subject peoples sensed opportunity. Foreign rivals watched carefully. The empire's enemies did not need to destroy the superpower directly if internal instability could slowly exhaust it first. The capital still projected strength, but beneath the ceremonial grandeur lay growing anxiety. Royal inscriptions from later periods often sound strangely defensive compared to earlier triumphal confidence. Kings emphasized legitimacy obsessively. Military victories were described in increasingly dramatic language. Building projects expanded as rulers attempted to demonstrate divine favor and political control during uncertain times. One lesser-known detail appears in surviving correspondence between provincial officials and the royal court. Some letters reveal delays in military support, shortages of supplies, and difficulties maintaining control over remote regions. What once functioned as an efficient imperial network began showing signs of strain under its own weight. Environmental pressure may have worsened the situation. Modern climate research suggests parts of the Near East experienced episodes of drought and agricultural instability during critical phases of imperial decline. The evidence remains incomplete and varies across regions, but several studies indicate reduced rainfall may have disrupted food production and intensified migration pressures. Irrigation systems required constant maintenance. If political disorder interrupted labour coordination even briefly, agricultural output could decline rapidly. Deforestation also altered landscapes around heavily populated centres. Timber consumption for construction, fuel, and military needs stripped forests from some regions over centuries. Soil erosion increased in vulnerable areas. Irrigated fields sometimes accumulated salt deposits that gradually reduced fertility. These changes did not destroy the empire suddenly, but they may have weakened its resilience during periods of crisis. Meanwhile, frontier threats multiplied. Mountain peoples raided border territories more aggressively. Nomadic groups moved unpredictably across vulnerable regions. Rival kingdoms, once intimidated by imperial power, began coordinating resistance more effectively. Some enemies learned imperial military methods and adapted their own forces accordingly. The empire could still win battles, but victories became more expensive. Campaigns stretched supply lines dangerously thin. Garrisons required reinforcement after repeated rebellions. Deportation policies created unstable population movements across provinces already under stress. The same centralized systems that once made expansion possible now amplified disruptions when communication or authority weakened. Economic inequality deepened as well. Wealth concentrated heavily around royal courts, military elites, and major urban centres, while ordinary populations carried growing burdens through taxation and labour obligations. Archaeological evidence from some provincial regions suggests periods of economic contraction, even while capitals continued displaying immense luxury. Empires often collapse unevenly. Peripheral regions weaken long before the centre recognises danger fully. And still, the rituals continued. Kings performed sacred ceremonies beneath towering temple walls. Processions celebrated imperial victories. Tribute arrived from surviving provinces. Official art continued depicting rulers as masters of the known world. To outsiders, the empire remained terrifying. Internally, however, fear was spreading upward toward the ruling class itself. The growing dependence on military force revealed a deeper weakness. The empire increasingly struggled to maintain loyalty through legitimacy alone. Provinces obeyed because armies existed nearby. Governors remained loyal because rebellion seemed dangerous. Once confidence in central authority weakened, the system risked unravelling quickly. Some rulers responded with harsher repression. Rebellions were crushed with escalating brutality. Surveillance intensified. Court politics became more paranoid. Powerful officials were removed or executed more frequently. These measures restored order temporarily, but often increased instability over time. Scholars still debate whether the empire could have reformed successfully under different leadership. No single explanation fully accounts for why some ancient superpowers stabilise while others spiral into collapse. Geography, climate, economics, military pressure, leadership, and chance all interact in ways difficult to reconstruct completely from surviving evidence. What appears increasingly clear is that the empire's greatest strength, its centralised control over enormous territories, also became its greatest vulnerability. If communication failed, provinces drifted away rapidly. If armies suffered major defeats, entire regions rebelled simultaneously. If succession crises disrupted leadership, governors pursued their own survival first. Complexity magnified every crisis, and beyond the borders, new powers were rising. Some were former subject peoples hardened by generations under imperial rule. Others came from frontier regions long considered secondary threats. Migrations reshaped political landscapes unpredictably. Alliances formed among groups once divided by fear of the empire. The superpower that had dominated the ancient world for centuries slowly found itself surrounded by enemies waiting for weakness. Perhaps the most unsettling detail is how ordinary the warning signs seemed at the time. Taxes increased, campaigns continued, officials complained, droughts disrupted harvests, Frontier raids intensified, kings built monuments celebrating victory, life carried on beneath the appearance of normal imperial continuity. No one standing in the crowded markets of the capitals could fully see how fragile the system had become. But somewhere beyond the palace walls and carved propaganda, the balance was already shifting. The empire still looked eternal. History had quietly begun preparing its collapse. The violence didn't arrive all at once. It spread gradually across the frontiers like cracks moving through ice, small at first, then suddenly impossible to contain. For generations, the empire had forced neighbouring peoples to adapt to its expansion. Now those same frontiers began producing new threats faster than imperial armies could suppress them. Rebellions flared in provinces once considered secure. Trade corridors became dangerous. Garrisons vanished without explanation. Entire regions slipped in and out of imperial control. From the capitals, rulers still announced victories. Royal inscriptions continued describing conquered enemies and triumphant campaigns. Tributes still entered palace storerooms. Ceremonies still projected confidence. But beneath the surface, military pressure was increasing everywhere at once. The empire had become trapped by the very scale of its own dominance. What survives in historical records suggests the later kings spent enormous energy moving constantly between crises. One year brought revolt in a western province. The next required campaigns against mountain tribes or rival kingdoms along distant rivers. Then came internal conspiracies, succession disputes, and renewed unrest in previously subdued territories. Stability became temporary and expensive. The frontiers never stopped demanding attention. Some of the most dangerous enemies emerged from regions the empire had long underestimated. Tribal confederations from rugged highlands learned how to exploit imperial overextension. Nomadic groups moved unpredictably through weakened border zones. Former subject peoples studied imperial tactics and adapted them for resistance. The empire still possessed larger armies and greater resources than most rivals individually, but increasingly it faced multiple threats simultaneously. One lesser-known detail reveals how unstable conditions had become. Archaeological surveys in several frontier regions show waves of abandoned settlements during periods associated with intensified warfare and political disruption. Villages disappeared, agricultural land reverted to scrub or desert, trade infrastructure deteriorated. These patterns suggest insecurity spreading far beyond official battlefields. The empire's enemies also learned patience. Earlier kingdoms had often confronted imperial armies directly and suffered catastrophic defeat. Later opponents relied more heavily on attrition, mobility, and timing. They attacked isolated garrisons, disrupted supply routes, encouraged rebellion among subject populations, and waited for succession crises before launching larger offensives. This strategy slowly exhausted imperial resources. Campaigns grew longer and more costly. Armies marching to suppress rebellion in one province left another exposed. Governors demanded reinforcements faster than the centre could provide them. Taxation increased to support military expenditures, placing additional pressure on populations already strained by instability and environmental stress. The capitals remained magnificent, but the empire's foundations were beginning to thin. Meanwhile, rival powers beyond the borders sensed opportunity. For centuries, many neighbouring states had defined their policies around surviving imperial aggression. Now the balance of fear shifted gradually. Alliances formed among groups that once distrusted one another deeply. Frontier kingdoms stopped viewing the empire as invincible. Some former vassals openly rebelled, others withheld tribute or delayed cooperation while testing imperial response times. The superpower still inspired fear, but fear alone no longer guaranteed obedience. Climate instability may have intensified the crisis further. Modern studies suggest several regions of the ancient Near East experienced periods of drought, crop failure, and population displacement during critical phases of imperial decline. Scholars still debate the precise scale of these environmental pressures, and no single explanation fully accounts for the empire's unravelling, but worsening conditions likely increased migration, economic disruption, and social tension across already vulnerable territories. The empire's administrative system struggled to absorb so many simultaneous shocks. Roads once used for rapid communication became dangerous during unrest. Supply caravans disappeared. Frontier fortresses required constant repair. Provincial officials sent increasingly desperate messages requesting military support or reporting rebellion. Some records simply stop abruptly, leaving historians to wonder whether cities were destroyed before further communication became possible. And then came the wars that changed everything. In the east and north, powerful coalitions began pushing directly into imperial territory. These were not isolated raids or temporary uprisings. Entire regions erupted into sustained conflict. Ancient chroniclers describe campaigns marked by extreme violence, collapsing alliances, and widespread devastation. The empire fought fiercely, but for the first time in centuries, it faced enemies capable of surviving repeated confrontation. The psychological impact must have been enormous. Imperial ideology depended on the assumption that the kings maintained divine order through military supremacy. Repeated setbacks threatened not only territorial control, but the sacred legitimacy supporting the entire political system. If the empire could bleed, then rebellion no longer seemed impossible. Inside the capitals, anxiety deepened. Court factions competed more aggressively for influence. Some rulers responded with purges and harsher repression. Others launched ambitious military campaigns hoping decisive victories would restore authority. Monumental building projects continued even during periods of growing instability, perhaps because rulers needed visible proof that imperial power remained intact. But stone monuments cannot stop systemic collapse. Archaeological evidence from several late imperial centres reveals signs of hurried fortification, destruction, abandonment, and economic contraction. Workshops closed. Administrative records became irregular. Some palaces show evidence of violent assault, others appear partially abandoned before final destruction. Ordinary people suffered first and worst. Farmers caught between armies lost harvests. Refugees fled collapsing frontier regions carrying disease, hunger, and stories of advancing enemies. Trade declined. Local famines likely emerged in vulnerable areas. Communities that had survived under imperial stability for generations suddenly faced uncertainty from every direction. And still, the wars spread. The empire continued fighting because it had no alternative. Retreat risked encouraging further rebellion. Negotiated weakness invited attack. Every province lost threatened additional collapse elsewhere. The system required constant authority to survive. That authority was beginning to fracture. Some governors pursued local survival over imperial loyalty. Garrisons isolated by unrest made independent decisions. Former subject populations revolted openly. Enemy coalitions advanced deeper into territories once considered untouchable. The empire's greatest advantage, centralized control over vast regions, now accelerated its decline. Disruption in one area quickly affected distant provinces connected through military, economic, and administrative networks. A failed harvest weakened supply chains. A lost fortress exposed trade routes. A rebellion disrupted taxation. Every crisis fed another. Historians still debate whether the final collapse felt sudden or gradual to those living through it. From a distance, the empire appears to fall rapidly within a few generations. For individuals inside the system, the decline likely felt uneven and confusing. Some cities still prospered while others burned. Victories occurred beside disasters. Daily life continued in certain regions even as neighbouring provinces descended into chaos. But by now, something irreversible had begun. The superpower that once terrified the ancient world was no longer expanding, it was fighting simply to remain alive. The end came through smoke, collapsing walls, and a silence that spread city by city across the empire's heartland. For centuries, the superpower had projected permanence. Its kings carved victories into stone meant to outlast generations. Its capitals rose from the plains like declarations that imperial authority belonged to the natural order of the world itself. Armies marched beneath banners that had terrified entire civilizations. Roads linked distant provinces to administrative centres, pulsing with wealth, ritual, and command. Then, within a relatively short span of history, the system began breaking apart faster than anyone inside it could fully stop. The final decades remain difficult to reconstruct with certainty because the evidence becomes fragmented precisely when events grow most catastrophic. Records end abruptly, entire archives vanish. Cities appear abandoned between one layer of occupation and the next. Scholars still debate the exact sequence of campaigns, alliances, betrayals, and environmental pressures that brought down the empire. But the broad outline is unmistakable. The superpower collapsed violently. Enemy coalitions advanced into territories long considered secure. Provincial loyalty weakened. Communication networks failed. Garrisons isolated from central authority either surrendered, fled, or disappeared entirely. The empire's rulers continued fighting desperately, but the machinery that once transformed conquest into stability could no longer hold together. One lesser-known detail emerges from excavated destruction layers in several former imperial centres. Archaeologists have found evidence that some cities attempted emergency fortification projects shortly before their destruction. Walls were repaired hastily using reused stone and mud brick. Storage rooms filled with grain and supplies suggest preparations for siege conditions. These were not peaceful declines. People knew danger was approaching. The capitals themselves became targets. For generations, they had symbolised imperial invincibility. Their palaces displayed scenes of conquered enemies kneeling before triumphant kings. Their temples reinforced the sacred legitimacy of empire. To destroy such cities carried enormous psychological meaning for the empire's enemies, and eventually the defences failed. Ancient accounts describe attacking forces entering imperial capitals after brutal campaigns that shattered remaining resistance. Fires spread through palace complexes filled with wooden roofs, textiles, records, furniture, and ceremonial objects accumulated across centuries. Temples collapsed, administrative archives burned, royal statues were damaged or deliberately defaced. Some destruction was strategic, some was symbolic, some likely emerged from the uncontrollable chaos of conquest itself. The fires preserved and erased history simultaneously. In certain buildings, collapsing roofs trapped clay tablets beneath layers of debris, while intense heat baked them hard enough to survive thousands of years underground. Elsewhere, records written on papyrus, parchment, or wood vanished completely. Libraries disappeared into ash. Languages lost their political centres. Memory fragmented. The empire's rulers faded from history with astonishing speed. Some kings died in battle. Others vanished from reliable records entirely. Competing ancient sources contradict one another regarding final campaigns and royal fates. The evidence remains incomplete because the civilization's own ability to document events collapsed alongside its political structure. What survived afterward was ruin. Travellers entering former imperial territories encountered abandoned capitals, where weeds pushed through cracked courtyards once crowded with officials and soldiers. Irrigation systems deteriorated without coordinated maintenance. Roads broke apart. canals filled with silt. In some regions, agricultural production declined sharply as warfare, migration, and political fragmentation disrupted centuries-old infrastructure. The collapse reshaped the geography of power across the Near East. Former subject peoples reclaimed independence or established new kingdoms atop imperial ruins. Rival powers divided surviving territories. Trade routes shifted. Frontier populations moved into regions previously controlled by imperial garrisons. The old order dissolved so thoroughly that within generations, entire political landscapes looked unrecognizable. And yet, traces lingered everywhere. Scattered soldiers continued resisting in isolated strongholds long after central authority vanished. Provincial administrators adapted to new rulers using skills learned under the empire. Conquerors inherited roads, fortifications, tax systems, and communication networks originally built by the civilization they destroyed. History rarely erases power completely. Some cities never recovered at all. Excavations at certain sites reveal abrupt abandonment following destruction layers. Buildings collapsed and remained untouched for centuries. Windblown dust accumulated over shattered walls. Wild vegetation reclaimed streets once crowded with merchants and processions. In especially arid regions, entire districts survived beneath desert sands almost exactly where they fell. The emotional experience of collapse is harder to recover. What did ordinary people feel watching the empire disintegrate around them? Relief, terror, exhaustion. Probably all at once, depending on who they were and where they lived. Conquered populations may have celebrated the fall of imperial authority, while simultaneously fearing the instability that followed. Loyal officials saw worlds built across generations vanish within their lifetimes. Refugees crossed a devastated landscape searching for safety in regions equally unstable. The empire's sacred foundations collapsed alongside its political ones. For centuries, kings have presented themselves as divinely favoured guardians of universal order. Their victories proved cosmic legitimacy. Their capitals embodied sacred authority. When those capitals burned and armies failed repeatedly, the ideological structure supporting empire shattered as well. No single explanation fully accounts for why the collapse accelerated so dramatically once it began. Military defeat mattered, internal instability mattered, economic strain mattered, climate pressure, migration, rebellion, and overextension all played roles. But large systems sometimes reach points where interconnected crises reinforce one another faster than recovery becomes possible. The empire had become too dependent on centralized power, constant military dominance, and uninterrupted communication across enormous territories. When those systems failed together, collapse spread rapidly, and still, memory remained strangely incomplete. Unlike some civilizations whose histories survived through continuous literary traditions, much of this empire's story vanished with its administrative and political centers. Later kingdoms reused palace stones without preserving the names of rulers who built them, languages evolved, archives disappeared beneath rubble, entire capitals faded into low hills beneath drifting sand and accumulated earth. Centuries later, local populations living near the ruins often no longer understood what had once stood there. The superpower that terrified the ancient world became a ghost, hidden beneath landscapes it once controlled absolutely. Only fragments survived openly, broken relief carvings showing kings hunting lions, burned tablets trapped beneath collapsed walls, half-buried statues with erased faces, strange mounds rising from plains where colossal palaces once stood. The empire had ruled through overwhelming visibility, its destruction buried it in silence. For centuries after the collapse, the empire existed mostly as rumour. Travellers crossed landscapes scattered with unnatural hills and broken stone without realising they were walking across the remains of some of the largest cities on Earth during the ancient world. Farmers dug irrigation channels through buried palace walls, villagers carried away carved blocks to build houses, bridges and fortifications. Wind and sand erased outlines that had once dominated horizons. The capitals disappeared slowly enough that no single generation fully noticed. In some regions, memories survived only as distorted legends. Local traditions spoke of giant kings, cursed cities, or vanished peoples punished by the gods. Strange sculptures half buried in the earth inspired stories about demons or forgotten races. Ancient roads remained visible in places long after the names of the rulers who built them had vanished from memory. The empire had once documented itself obsessively. Kings ordered campaigns carved into stone. Officials preserved administrative records on thousands of clay tablets. Palaces displayed reliefs celebrating victories and tribute from distant lands. Yet despite this enormous archive, later civilizations inherited only fragments. Fires destroyed libraries. Languages died. New powers rewrote regional history around themselves. In some cases, deliberate erasure played a role. Later rulers occupying former imperial territories had little interest in preserving memories of the superpower that once dominated them. Monuments were dismantled, capitals repurposed. Official traditions emphasized newer dynasties while older imperial identities faded into obscurity. What survives in the archaeological record suggests systematic reuse of imperial materials across generations, and still, the ruins waited beneath the ground. One of the strangest aspects of the empire's disappearance is how physically enormous its buried cities remained even after collective memory collapsed. Some ancient capitals covered vast areas with palace complexes, temples, defensive walls, canals, gardens, workshops, and residential districts extending for miles. Yet over centuries, Mud brick decayed into soil-like mounds difficult to distinguish from natural terrain at a distance. Archaeologists later gave many of these mounds a simple name tells. From the outside, they appeared almost ordinary, but beneath them rested stacked layers of forgotten civilization accumulated across thousands of years. The Empire's greatest cities became landscapes hiding themselves in plain sight. The rediscovery began gradually. Early travellers moving through the Near East occasionally described strange ruins and colossal sculptures emerging from the earth. Some reported seeing enormous carved figures guarding buried gateways. Others copied inscriptions no one could read anymore. European explorers in later centuries often arrived expecting little more than biblical geography or classical ruins. Instead, they encountered traces of something far older and stranger. At first, many misunderstood what they found. Ancient relief carvings depicting military campaigns, winged guardian beings, and royal processions seemed almost unreal compared to familiar histories centered on Greece, Rome, or Egypt. The scale of certain ruins challenged assumptions about which civilizations had once dominated the region. Scholars still debate how much early interpretation was shaped by existing cultural biases, but there is little doubt the Empire's rediscovery forced historians to rethink the ancient world itself. One lesser-known detail reveals how accidental some discoveries truly were. In several famous sites, local villagers had long known about buried sculptures or stone fragments protruding from the ground. Foreign archaeologists did not uncover entirely unknown worlds so much as recognise the significance of landscapes local populations already navigated daily. Then came the inscriptions. For generations, the strange wedge-shaped writing covering tablets and palace walls remained unreadable. Thousands of records existed physically but were effectively silent. The civilization's voice remained trapped behind a lost script modern scholars could not yet understand. Decipherment changed everything. Slowly, painstakingly. Linguists began unlocking ancient languages preserved in royal inscriptions and administrative archives. Names of kings emerged first, then military campaigns, diplomatic letters, tax records, astronomical observations, legal disputes, inventories, prayers, and ritual texts. Entire worlds hidden beneath dust began speaking again after more than 2,000 years of silence. The emotional impact on early archaeologists must have been extraordinary. Rooms sealed beneath collapsed palaces suddenly yielded libraries containing the daily operations of a vanished superpower. Clay tablets preserved conversations between rulers and governors, requests for military reinforcements, reports of rebellion, list of tribute, and records of celestial events. The Empire was no longer myth. It became historically visible again, and the scale shocked scholars. What survived in the record suggested a civilization far more organised, extensive, and influential than many earlier historians had imagined. The Empire had governed enormous territories through sophisticated administration, military logistics, and communication systems operating across multiple cultures and environments. Excavations revealed astonishing details of urban life as well. Palace reliefs displayed artistic mastery of movement, texture, and narrative. Massive guardian figures emerged from buried gateways nearly intact. Royal archives preserved correspondence between distant rulers. Burn layers confirmed violent destruction associated with historical campaigns. In some cases, archaeologists could trace final moments of cities through scattered possessions abandoned beneath collapsed structures. Yet rediscovery also exposed how much remained missing. Most ancient texts had vanished forever. Many capitals were only partially excavated. Organic materials decayed long ago. Countless smaller settlements remained buried beneath modern cities. Farmland, or desert landscapes impossible to excavate fully. The evidence continues expanding, but the picture remains incomplete. No single explanation fully accounts for why the Empire faded so deeply from global historical consciousness compared to some other ancient civilizations. Geography mattered. Later political dominance by rival powers mattered. The fragility of ancient records mattered. Cultural bias within early scholarship mattered too. For centuries, history focused heavily on civilizations whose texts survived continuously through later traditions. The buried superpower lacked that advantage. Much of its archive remained underground, while narratives written by enemies shaped surviving memory above ground. Even today, discoveries continue changing understanding of the Empire. New excavations uncover additional provincial centres, military fortifications, irrigation systems, and archives. Climate studies reveal environmental pressures invisible to earlier historians. Advances in satellite imaging identify buried roads and settlement patterns across landscapes once thought empty. Each discovery adds complexity. The forgotten empire is still emerging from the earth piece by piece. And perhaps the strangest realization of all is this. For thousands of years, one of the most powerful civilizations in human history lay hidden beneath ordinary landscapes, while later societies walked unknowingly across the ruins. Its cities had vanished, its memory had fractured, but the ground never truly forgot. As more ruins emerged from the earth and more inscriptions surrendered their meaning to modern scholars, an unsettling question began taking shape. How could a civilization this vast, this organised, and this influential have slipped so far into obscurity in the first place? The Empire had ruled enormous territories for centuries. Its armies reshaped the political map of the ancient Near East. Its administrators managed systems of communication and taxation that later powers quietly imitated. And yet for long stretches of later history, it barely existed in public memory except as fragments inside hostile traditions and scattered ruins. Part of the answer lies in destruction itself. Unlike civilizations whose libraries survived through continuous copying, much of this empire's written world depended on political centres that vanished violently. When capitals burned, archives collapsed with them. Clay tablets survived only under unusual conditions. Papyrus and parchment disappeared almost entirely. Administrative systems that once generated mountains of records stopped functioning suddenly, leaving history broken into disconnected pieces. The empire's own success also contributed to its disappearance. Its rulers concentrated enormous authority in centralised capitals filled with archives, monuments, and ceremonial spaces designed to project imperial permanence. But centralisation creates vulnerability. When those cities fell, the empire lost not only political control, but much of its memory infrastructure at the same time. And later, civilizations had little incentive to preserve that memory carefully. Many successor states emerged from regions once conquered or dominated by the empire. Their identities formed partly through resistance against the old superpower. Historical traditions written centuries later emphasized imperial cruelty, arrogance, and divine punishment rather than administrative sophistication or cultural achievements. The empire survived in memory primarily as a warning. Some of those warnings became foundational narratives. Religious texts composed and edited across later centuries preserved echoes of invasions, sieges, deportations, and imperial terror. These accounts remained historically valuable, but they reflected perspectives shaped by trauma and resistance. The empire appeared as an overwhelming destructive force rather than a fully realized civilization with internal complexity and long historical development. This imbalance influenced later scholarship profoundly. For generations, historians studying the ancient Near East relied heavily on sources produced by civilizations that opposed or outlived the empire. Without direct access to imperial archives, the superpower appeared one-dimensional, brutal, militaristic, and strangely disconnected from broader human history. The rediscovery of palace libraries changed that image dramatically. Suddenly the civilization spoke in its own voice again. Administrators recorded crop distributions, scholars tracked eclipses and planetary movements, diplomats negotiated alliances and marriages, governors complained about taxes, rebellions, and missing supplies. Kings boasted constantly, but beneath the propaganda appeared a functioning society filled with ordinary concerns and systemic pressures. One lesser-known detail especially transformed scholarly understanding. Excavated archives revealed that the empire preserved texts from older civilizations as well. Scribes copied myths, scientific observations, religious traditions, and literary works inherited from earlier cultures. The superpower was not merely a destroyer, it also acted as a collector and transmitter of knowledge across regions and generations. The empire had absorbed the ancient world while ruling it. Yet even modern rediscovery remains uneven. Some imperial capitals are now famous archaeological sites visited by scholars and tourists from around the world. Others remain partially excavated or inaccessible due to political instability, warfare, or environmental conditions. Countless smaller settlements still lie buried beneath modern towns and agricultural land. Entire archives may remain undiscovered. The evidence continues changing. New technologies reveal structures invisible from ground level. Satellite imagery traces ancient canals, roads, and settlement networks across landscapes once thought empty. Climate science reconstructs drought cycles and ecological pressures affecting imperial stability. Digital analysis reconnects fragmented tablets scattered among museums worldwide. And still, enormous gaps remain. Scholars debate population sizes, military numbers, economic output, environmental stress, and even basic chronology in certain periods. Ancient royal inscriptions exaggerate victories constantly. Archaeology provides physical evidence but rarely complete explanations. No single interpretation fully accounts for how the empire operated across centuries of expansion and decline. This uncertainty matters because it reminds us how fragile historical memory truly is. Modern people often imagine major civilizations as permanent fixtures of recorded history. But the forgotten superpower demonstrates how easily even dominant societies can dissolve into partial silence. Had a handful of palace archives not survived accidental baking during destructive fires, much of the empire's internal history might remain unknowable today. The same vulnerability exists for countless other ancient cultures. Entire kingdoms disappeared without leaving decipherable writing at all. Languages vanished, oral traditions fractured, landscapes transformed. Future civilizations inherited ruins without understanding who built them or why. History is not a complete archive of humanity. It is a damaged survival. The empire's rediscovery also forced historians to reconsider older assumptions about civilization itself. For centuries, narratives of the ancient world focused heavily on cultures that later European and Mediterranean traditions preserved continuously. The buried superpower complicated that picture. Here was a civilization of extraordinary scale and sophistication that later memory had nearly erased despite its immense historical impact. Its roads influenced later empires. Its administrative systems anticipated later imperial governance. Its military organization reshaped warfare across the region. Its artistic and architectural traditions spread through conquered territories long after political collapse. Even some of its enemies borrowed its methods while publicly condemning it. History had not truly erased the empire. It had absorbed it invisibly. This realization carries an uncomfortable implication. Modern understanding of the ancient world remains shaped partly by survival accidents. Some civilizations dominate historical imagination because their texts survived continuously, or aligned with later political traditions. Others faded because archives burned, languages died, or successor states preferred forgetting. The forgotten superpower became a case study in historical disappearance itself. Its ruins remind archaeologists how much remains buried beneath ordinary landscapes. Its fragmented records reveal how incomplete all reconstructions of the past truly are. Its collapse demonstrates how quickly centralized systems can unravel when environmental pressure, military strain, political instability, and economic stress converge simultaneously, and its rediscovery reveals something equally haunting. Civilizations do not vanish cleanly. They linger beneath later societies in roads, myths, administrative habits, technologies, ruins, borrowed symbols, and inherited fears. People walk across their foundations without knowing. Later empires repeat their structures unconsciously. Memory survives in distorted forms long after names disappear. The ancient superpower history nearly erased still shapes the modern understanding of empire, collapse, and power itself. Not because it survived intact, but because enough fragments endure to remind humanity how close even the greatest civilizations can come to being forgotten completely. Even after the empire vanished politically, its shadow remained woven through the civilizations that followed. Roads continued carrying merchants across routes first secured by imperial armies. Provincial systems shaped how later rulers organized conquered territories. Military tactics refined by centuries of campaigning survived in modified forms long after the original capitals lay in ruins beneath drifting earth. The superpower disappeared as a state. But many of its structures proved too effective for history to abandon completely. This is one of the strangest truths about collapsed empires. Their enemies often inherit more from them than they are willing to admit. The kingdoms and powers that emerged after the collapse publicly celebrated liberation from imperial domination. Inscriptions praised victorious coalitions and newly independent rulers. Yet beneath those declarations, successor states quietly adopted methods developed by the civilization they replaced. Administrative districts, taxation systems, military logistics, road maintenance, and even royal symbolism carried traces of imperial influence. The empire had standardized power across enormous territories. Later rulers discovered that such systems remained useful regardless of who controlled them. Archaeological evidence reveals continuity in surprising places. Some provincial centres continued functioning under new governments with only partial interruption. Local officials trained under imperial administration adapted to new rulers rather than disappearing entirely. Trade networks reorganised but did not vanish. Agricultural infrastructure outlived dynasties because canals and irrigation systems remained essential for survival. One lesser-known detail appears in the survival of scribal traditions. Certain forms of record-keeping and scholarly practice continued for generations after imperial collapse, because educated administrators carried knowledge across changing political landscapes. Even when languages evolved and dynasties shifted, practical systems of governance often endured. The empire's influence spread through memory as well as infrastructure. For later civilizations, the superpower became both warning and model. Rulers feared repeating its collapse while admiring its capacity for control. Historians and religious writers portrayed it as arrogant and violent, yet military leaders studied the effectiveness of its campaigns. Its story became morally useful even as its methods remained politically attractive. This contradiction appears repeatedly throughout human history. Powerful states condemn earlier empires publicly, while unconsciously reproducing many of their structures. The forgotten superpower became an ancient example of that cycle. Its artistic legacy survived too. Winged guardian figures, royal hunting imagery, monumental relief carving, and ceremonial architecture influenced neighbouring cultures long after the empire's destruction. Some artistic forms spread through direct inheritance. Others survived indirectly through imitation and adaptation. Fragments of imperial style appeared in regions far beyond the original heartland, and beneath later cities, the old capitals remained waiting. Centuries after collapse, new populations settled among the ruins or directly atop them. Mud brick walls eroded into foundations supporting newer buildings. Broken palace stones entered fresh construction projects. Ancient canals guided later agriculture. Landscapes shaped by imperial engineering continued influencing settlement patterns long after the civilization's name faded. The empire became physically embedded in the region itself. Modern archaeology often reveals these layers stacked directly upon one another. Beneath medieval structures lie classical remains. Beneath those appear older settlements connected to the forgotten superpower. History accumulates vertically in places where humans repeatedly rebuild on top of earlier worlds. The deeper excavations go, the more continuity emerges beneath apparent disappearance. Scholars still debate how directly later empires inherited political ideas from the superpower, because evidence for intellectual transmission remains incomplete. Some influences were likely indirect rather than deliberate, yet parallels continue appearing in communication systems, provincial administration, military organisation, and symbolic kingship across later Near Eastern states. No single civilization invents empire alone. Techniques evolve cumulatively through conflict, adaptation, and survival. The forgotten superpower refined methods that later powers expanded further. In that sense, its disappearance was never absolute. Pieces of it survived inside the political DNA of later empires. Its collapse also shaped historical imagination in darker ways. Later generations looked back on the ruined capitals as reminders that even overwhelming power could fail catastrophically. The empire's destruction became symbolic evidence of the fragility hidden beneath monumental ambition. Ancient writers used its downfall to illustrate moral lessons about arrogance, cruelty, divine judgment, or the instability of worldly power. Ruins encouraged that interpretation naturally. Travellers moving through abandoned palace complexes encountered shattered statues, collapsed halls, and broken inscriptions scattered across landscapes once controlled by rulers who claimed dominion over the known world. The contrast between past grandeur and present silence felt almost theatrical, and yet the silence was never complete. Local populations preserved fragments of memory through stories and place names. Religious traditions carried echoes of imperial violence across centuries. Archaeological remains quietly shaped settlement and agriculture, even when forgotten politically. The empire lingered like buried architecture beneath later history. Modern rediscovery intensified that haunting effect. Excavated reliefs showing endless military campaigns feel strangely immediate even today. Administrative tablets reveal officials worrying about supplies, rebellion, taxation, and communication in ways surprisingly recognizable to modern bureaucratic states. Climate studies expose environmental pressures resembling challenges faced by later civilizations. The empire begins to feel less like a distant anomaly, and more like an early version of recurring human patterns: expansion, centralization, extraction, overconfidence, collapse. The forgotten superpower matters partly because it reveals how ancient these cycles truly are. Its rulers believed organization and force could permanently stabilize a dangerous world. For centuries, they seemed correct. Their armies dominated rivals, their capitals glittered with wealth from conquered territories, their administrative systems coordinated resources across enormous distances, their ideology claimed divine legitimacy. Then interconnected crises overwhelmed the system faster than recovery became possible. The same complexity that created imperial strength accelerated imperial collapse. This remains one of the empire's most enduring lessons. Modern societies often imagine technological sophistication protects civilizations from the vulnerabilities that destroyed ancient powers. Yet the forgotten superpower demonstrates how interconnected systems can become simultaneously resilient and fragile. Large networks generate enormous capacity while functioning smoothly. When disruption spreads across enough sectors at once, collapse can accelerate unexpectedly. The empire's ruins carry that warning quietly. Beneath desert sands and broken stone lie the remains of a civilization once convinced it stood at the center of the world. Its kings commanded armies feared across continents. Its roads connected distant peoples. Its archives recorded celestial events, taxes, labours, and conquest with obsessive precision. And still, history nearly lost it. Perhaps that is why the rediscovered empire feels so unsettling today. Not because it vanished, but because it almost vanished completely. Word count 180, awaiting continue, tip section Moilum. Today, the ruins of the forgotten superpower lie scattered across landscapes shaped by thousands of years of survival, conquest, rebuilding, and erosion. Some remain exposed beneath open skies where colossal stone guardians still stare across empty plains. Others sleep beneath crowded modern cities where traffic moves above buried palaces and ancient archives no one has excavated yet. In remote regions, wind still uncovers fragments of carved reliefs after storms. As though the earth itself continues releasing pieces of memory slowly and reluctantly. The empire is gone, but its fingerprints remain everywhere. Archaeologists tracing ancient road systems can still follow the logic of imperial expansion across deserts and river valleys. Historians studying administration discover familiar patterns of centralized power, taxation, military logistics, and controlled communication. Climate scientists examining collapsed agricultural zones uncover warnings about environmental strain that feel disturbingly modern. The empire survives less as a single story than as a vast collection of echoes spread across time. And perhaps that is the final irony. The civilization once obsessed with projecting permanence became one of history's clearest demonstrations of impermanence. Its rulers believed they had solved the ancient problem of instability through organization and force. Their armies moved farther than most rivals imagined possible. Their capitals concentrated wealth from enormous territories. Their engineers redirected water through harsh landscapes. Their scribes documented life with extraordinary detail. Their kings carved victories into stone, intended to outlive memory itself. In many ways, they succeeded. For centuries, the empire dominated the ancient Near East with a scale and sophistication few contemporary states could challenge. Entire civilizations reorganized themselves around the reality of imperial power. Trade routes shifted. Borders disappeared, languages mixed, technologies spread. Political systems evolved in response to the superpower's presence, yet none of it proved permanent. The same systems that created strength eventually magnified weakness. Expansion increased dependency on military success. Centralization accelerated collapse when communication failed. Monumental cities consumed enormous resources while becoming vulnerable symbolic targets during crisis. Administrative complexity created fragility hidden beneath outward stability. No single disaster destroyed the empire. Not one invasion, not one drought, not one rebellion. Instead, interconnected pressures accumulated until the civilization could no longer absorb them simultaneously. Environmental stress weakened agricultural systems, military overextension exhausted resources, political instability disrupted succession and governance. Frontier enemies adapted, subject populations resisted, trade fluctuated, confidence eroded. then the structure collapsed faster than its rulers ever imagined possible. This pattern feels ancient because it is ancient. The forgotten superpower reveals truths about civilization that remain uncomfortable across every era. Human societies build systems to create stability, but large systems always carry hidden vulnerabilities. Wealth concentrates, power centralizes, infrastructure expands beyond what any individual fully understands. Success creates confidence, confidence encourages further expansion, and eventually, complexity itself becomes difficult to sustain. The Empire's rediscovery matters because it restores scale to that lesson. For centuries, later civilizations remembered only fragments distorted through fear, religion, and inherited hostility. Modern archaeology revealed something larger and more human beneath the myths. The superpower was brutal. Certainly, its rulers used terror deliberately. Its campaigns devastated populations. But it was also organized, adaptive, intellectually active, artistically sophisticated, and deeply aware of the dangerous world surrounding it. Its people were not monsters from legend. They were humans trying to impose order on uncertainty using the tools available to them. That may be the most unsettling realization of all. The Empire does not feel alien once its archives begin speaking again. Officials worry about supply shortages. Governors complain about unrest. Priests search desperately for signs explaining political instability. Farmers struggle beneath taxation and environmental pressure. Kings fear losing legitimacy. Refugees flee collapsing frontiers. Across thousands of years, the emotional texture of collapse remains strangely familiar. Even the rediscovery process carries symbolic weight. Modern archaeologists excavating buried capitals often work through layers of destruction left by the Empire's final centuries. Burned rooms preserve tablets describing administrative routines interrupted suddenly by violence. Half-finished construction projects freeze moments of political ambition never completed. Abandoned storage jars, broken tools, and scattered personal objects reveal ordinary lives caught beneath historical catastrophe. The ruins remind us that civilizations do not disappear abstractly. People live inside collapses while trying to understand them, and often, they cannot. Those standing in the imperial capitals during the final generations likely believed recovery remained possible. Armies still existed, temples still operated, officials still collected taxes, kings still issued decrees beneath carved reliefs celebrating ancient victories. Daily life continued unevenly even while the system weakened around them. Collapse rarely announces itself clearly in the moment. It becomes obvious afterward. Scholars still debate countless details surrounding the Empire's rise and fall. New discoveries constantly reshape understanding. Fresh excavations reveal additional provinces, archives, environmental pressures, and cultural connections. Satellite imagery uncovers hidden infrastructure beneath modern landscapes. Technologies not yet invented may transform interpretation again in the future. The forgotten superpower is still emerging from the ground. Its story remains unfinished. And perhaps that incompleteness is appropriate, because history itself survives imperfectly. Entire civilizations vanish, leaving almost nothing behind. Others endure only through hostile accounts written by enemies. Archaeology reconstructs fragments. Languages are deciphered slowly. Landscapes conceal more than they reveal. The ancient superpower nearly disappeared forever, despite once ruling much of the known world. That fact alone changes how human history feels. It reminds us that memory is fragile, power is temporary, and even the largest empires can dissolve so thoroughly that later generations walk unknowingly above their ruins for centuries before finally hearing their voices again. The wind still moves across the old capitals at dusk. It passes through broken gateways where colossal guardian figures once watched over kings convinced their rule would last forever. It drifts across buried roads that carried armies, merchants, tribute caravans, and refugees through landscapes now quiet beneath open sky. In the fading light, the ruins lose sharpness and begin blending back into the earth from which they emerged. For a long time, that is exactly what happened. The empire collapsed, its cities burned, its archives vanished beneath rubble, and slowly, generation after generation, memory thinned. Names disappeared from common speech, monuments became quarries, palaces became hills. The world moved forward while one of its greatest superpowers slipped beneath the surface of history almost unnoticed, yet traces endured stubbornly. A carved stone too large to move, a road still useful centuries later, a story carried through hostile traditions, a clay tablet hardened accidentally in fire, a buried wall surviving beneath desert sand. Human civilizations vanish unevenly. Something always remains. The rediscovered empire feels haunting partly because its story seems both distant and familiar at the same time. The details belong to another age of chariots, river kingdoms, bronze weapons, and sacred kingship. But the deeper patterns remain recognizable. Expansion creates wealth and instability together. Systems grow too complex to fully control. Power concentrates. Frontiers harden. Environmental pressure accumulates quietly in the background. Confidence blinds rulers to fragility until the structure begins failing faster than anyone expected. Then future generations inherit ruins and questions. Perhaps that is why archaeologists continue returning to these ancient sites year after year. Beneath the dust lies more than lost history. There is also perspective. The fallen capitals remind modern societies that permanence is often an illusion created by successful systems during moments of stability. Even the strongest civilizations exist inside landscapes, climates, economies, and political tensions they never completely master. The forgotten superpower once believed it stood at the centre of the world. Now its broken cities rest beneath open sky, while distant winds move through empty halls, where kings once commanded armies feared across continents. And somewhere beneath the earth, still waiting in silence, more of its story remains undiscovered.